Hi everyone, welcome to another Live Safe Tool video. The purpose of this video is to go over the concept and the methods that go into the equity tool. So the equity tool is essentially a tool that allows us to visualize the answer to the question, what would happen in terms of mortality if everyone in the country reached the same coverage level as the richest quintile for each intervention individually in the following year? So we have a couple of keywords going on here. Our target will be the coverage level of the richest quintile in the country. We also have to pay attention to the fact that each intervention is being scaled up individually. And we also have to remember that our time frame is up until the following year. So what do we mean by equity? For the purposes of the list equity tool, we are focusing exclusively on economic equity. Household survey data is available to us disaggregated by wealth quintiles, so you can get the coverage in each separate with wealth quintile. And which means that for each intervention, we can actually get the coverage rate of the top wealth quintile. So the top wealth quintile means the wealthiest 20% of the population. Then the equity tool will use this coverage rate as a scale-up target for the entire country. So bring up all of the other quintiles to that same coverage that you can experience at the wealthiest 20% of the population. And this particularly helps to target within country inequalities, meaning the financial inequalities that exist in a given country. And a big argument for why we would do this type of analysis is that this target, unlike missed opportunities, which gives us maybe in some cases an unrealistic target of 90%, in the case of the equity tool, we can argue that it's somewhat of a feasible target since 20% of the population already has this level, has this coverage. So this is just a visualization of coverage levels for one intervention, ANC4. As you can see, in pretty much all countries, it's almost a linear increase for most of these countries between the poorest people who are in the lighter green and the richest people who are in the dark green. Even though it's not always linear, as it is the case in Gambia, the top wealth quintile always has the highest coverage. This is not necessarily true for all interventions always, but this is a very typical case where intervention coverage increases as financial accessibility increases also. And this here is the visualization of what the equity tool does. So it brings up that coverage of all of the wealth quintiles all the way up to that top wealth quintile in the following year. A little bit more on the concept of the equity tool. So as we've said, it's a visualization tool. It's not an analysis tool per se, but it does allow us to visualize an analysis and to compare the relative impact of different interventions if we brought them to the top wealth quintiles coverage. It's a quick and easy first look to see where we have the most potential for a life save for each intervention individually. And it does not require users to have a lot of prior knowledge about the current knowledge of the country. So LIST by default already has all of the information that we need for this analysis stored within it. It's a great starting point if we are looking to prioritize interventions or if we're trying to help ourselves with planning a program. This is a great first step. It does not give us all of the information necessarily that we need to make an informed decision about which intervention to prioritize, but it does give us an excellent starting point to go from. So the way that the equity tool works in the software is it scales up one intervention at a time to see the impact of that single intervention in isolation. So if you're using the default data from list, all the interventions remain at their current coverage except one intervention at a time, which is scaled up to the highest wealth quintiles coverage in the following year. Only that one single intervention. And the tool does that sequentially for each intervention, one at a time. In the case that the coverage for the other wealth quintiles is already equal to or superior to the top wealth quintiles coverage rate, in that case, list keeps that coverage as it is. So if your Q4 coverage is 70%, your Q5 coverage is 65%, the Q4 coverage will remain at 70%. In the equity tool, as in elsewhere in list, you always have the opportunity to use custom data if that's what you're interested in doing. So to do so, you would use a country projection using the main list software, and you could create it either at a national level or a subnational level, depending on what you're interested in, using your custom data. And then you as the user can choose which target you'd like to use as a scale up. So in this case, you would not necessarily need to set it to the highest wealth quintiles. And in terms of the results that are outputted from the equity tool, it shows the number of additional deaths prevented, so meaning the number of lives saved, essentially. And that corresponds to the number of deaths without the intervention scale-up minus the number of deaths with that intervention scale-up. So essentially, the difference between what would happen if we changed nothing at all as compared to what would happen if we scaled this one intervention up to the coverage of the highest wealth quintile. The largest bars, which will be displayed on the left side of the graph, represent the highest impact interventions, and they'll have the highest impact for one of these reasons or any combination of these reasons. So one, if there's a very unequal coverage between the top wealth quintile and the other wealth quintiles, so if you're looking at a drastic increase from your Q1 to your Q5, in that case, you'll have a high impact on mortality because you'll have increased your coverage a lot for many people. If this is an intervention that has an impact on a large cause of death, meaning if this is an intervention that has an impact on, for example, malaria in a country where there's very high malaria mortality, in that case, increasing the coverage of an intervention that has an impact on such a heavy cause of death will have a big impact on overall mortality as well. And a third reason why this intervention might have such a big impact is that the intervention could be very effective at averting this cause-specific death. So, for example, vaccinations can be very, very effective tools. So if you increase your vaccination coverage rate, even if it's not increasing by that much, just the fact that it's such an effective intervention will mean that it will have a higher impact on mortality than less effective interventions, for example. The equity tool, as everything in lists, depends very much on data availability. So if we don't have recent data or high quality data available, unfortunately, the results from the equity tool won't be any better than the inputs than we put in. The equity tool is an excellent tool to select which interventions to target if our main concern is addressing the inequalities in our country. However, the equity tool does not give us any information on the feasibility or on how to implement these scale-ups of interventions. So there's no indication on how to go about it. It can just guide you into investigating where you might want to focus your efforts. A final very important point is that in the overall list software, Impact is not calculated, let me try that again. Impact is calculated sequentially, meaning if you have multiple interventions that have an impact on the same cause-specific mortality, the impact of the interventions that are higher up in the continuum of care will be calculated first, and the impact of all following interventions as you go along the continuum of care will be calculated only on the residual death. So for example, if you have a preventive intervention and a curative intervention that both have an impact on the same cause-specific mortality, the impact of the preventive one will be calculated first, and the impact of the curative one will only be calculated on the lives that have not already been saved by your preventive intervention. So that's how the general list software works. The equity tool does not work this way. So as we've insisted during this video, this only models what happens if you were to scale up each individual intervention. So if you try to sum up the impact, if you try to sum up the bars altogether, you'll be double counting the lives that were saved by preventive interventions, for example, and curative interventions. There's no separation here, and you will double count. So the impact cannot be summed across the interventions in the equity tool. So this is a typical output that you can get from the equity tool. So you'll see the number of total additional deaths prevented, which also means it's completely synonymous with number of lives saved. You'll have your country, and this video is being recorded in 2018, so the following year will be 2019. You'll be able to visualize the number of stillbirths averted, the number of neonatal deaths averted, the number of child deaths averted, and the number of maternal deaths averted in red, blue, green, and purple respectively. And as you'll see, the interventions on the left of the graph are those that will have the highest impact, which also means that these are the interventions that are most unequal in their coverage based on which wealth quintile you belong to, and so on and so forth, in decreasing order going to the right. If you'd like to learn more about how to manipulate the software, there is a separate video called Software Demonstration Equity Tool, which will allow you to investigate a little bit more of the things that you can do with Equity Tool, as well as how to use the software to get the type of outputs that you're interested in. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you for listening.